Oh, well, there was one clip where the other team like tried to out.
Oh, Mercer. No, Whitman. Sorry, Whitman.
I think it was Whitman. Yeah, where they like poured water on them, and and they're like, dude, they're trying to go for a culture jamming argument, but you can't out crazy Ophelia.
Yeah, I love those clips.
You can't out crazy
You
me.
gotta see the movie because the movie, West Georgia was one of the teams they follow around in the movie, so there's a lot more like speeches and individual rounds and everything.
Hey.
Could I just get the name? Okay, so Devner, and that's you guys are Nick.
Oh yeah.
We are Nick.
Evergrey is half.
Evergrey.
Ever something.
Evergrey, Earl Grey.
The first speaker will be last name Panda, like the bear.
First speaker for Neg.
First speaker for half is Panda.
Panda.
For Nick, it's dinner.
Dinner. Like
Panda?
Governor.
See the board. D-E-M-B.
And then the number two for the affirmative?
Lee, Albert Lee was one.
L-I or L-E?
L-E.
L-E?
Just
one
E. One.
Oh, one.
What was that? Albert Lee, 1E. Room 130.
like L-E-E or L-I?
1E, so L.
L-E?
Yeah.
So, I guess before we start judging preferences,
Yeah.
You want to go first?
You go ahead.
Well,
You are sitting in the middle.
well, I'm going to say again, any specific questions?
For you, no, you've done this before. I guess I would ask, what do you default to for magnitude, and do you default to competing interpretation for reasonability for theory? Well, first of all, are you okay with like theory and top down
Survival for the argument, so make argument which makes sense. Speak very slowly. So,
and are you?
I'm okay with speed, topicality, and criticisms. In fact, I prefer criticisms.
I'd probably say that in a case where not all judges on the panel are fast judges, that accommodates the thing.
I mean, yeah, we're not gonna.
Yeah, I'm not gonna go like super crazy fast.
Okay.
If any of you think that I'm going too fast, like you guys included, just like hold up a hand for sake here. That goes to my partner. And probably
Don't hold up the hand, just stay clear.
Okay,
Because
just
that
okay.
way, like when they're like delivering their speech, they can just like slow down.
Okay. So just like shout clear if I'm going too fast. So I am at first speaker, Panda. Give me 2 seconds to write down my name on whatever ballot or ballot you have. So I'd like to extend a warm blanket of thanks over everyone for coming here. Spectators, judges, partner, and opponent. Off-time roadmap. We're going to go framework and then work with judges. Okay, let's start time now. We stand on the firmest affirmation of the resolution resolved. The United States Congress should grant the Trade Promotion Authority to the President of the United States, and our plan is basically verbatim. You just take out the should. Our plan is Congress grants Obama the TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority. So the funding, like you don't actually need any funding for this. The time frame is ASAP. We're going to be weighing this around on net benefits. So I'm going to go ahead and explain the Trade Promotion Authority, if that's cool with you. So the Trade Promotion Authority basically says that in terms of trade agreements, the President of the United States, so like Obama, can basically, Congress can still approve or disapprove stuff, that's not changed, but Congress cannot amend or filibuster basically the trade agreements that the President is pushing through. And we're going to be getting on to define amend and filibuster like very specifically and explain how we have advantages. Does Nick have any questions?
No.
Okay, cool. Let's go on to the first advantage. Basically, passing the so basically, not letting Congress filibuster is good. So this is one of the two things that it does. It doesn't let Congress filibuster. It doesn't let Congress amend. So we're going to explain why those are good and then go on to that. So advantage one is not letting Congress filibuster is good. So the first uniqueness is the threat of the filibuster makes Senate and House not schedule legislation, according to Senator Carl Levin. The next uniqueness is that there's huge Congress gridlock and little activity caused by these weapons of mass obstruction that essentially are filibusters, according to Senator Harry Reid. The third uniqueness is that there are no good filibusters more, as seen as the 1939 film Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The fourth uniqueness is that lobbying happens a lot because of filibustering. Essentially, the senator that filibusters doesn't need to go public, so they do get lobbied by special interest groups, and this does lead to corruption. So basically, for those 4 uniqueness points, we're presenting the position that basically filibustering in the world that we live in today, the status quo, is bad. So here's the link. Basically, passing the TPA eliminates the congressional ability to filibuster. The internal link is pretty obvious. And so we believe that the impacts off of this are basically more democratic activity, more congressional activity, more things passed, just less lobbying and less corruption, and basically more public's faith in the government. And I'll be explaining on these all more later, but essentially it boils down to, because the Senate can't basically because Congress can't just randomly filibuster things, they move a lot smoother, there's a lot less lobbying, and it gives the public renewed faith in the government because the government does actually do more things. I'll take a second.
Are you planning to prevent filibusters on anything except trade agreements?
No. So the plan of the Trade Promotion Authority basically says you can't filibuster or amend on trade agreements. And so we're basically saying, yes, filibustering is bad, so filibustering on trade agreements is bad, so we prevent that, so that's good. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Cool. So the second advantage is going to be that not letting Congress amend trade agreements is good. So the first uniqueness is, in a specific South China Sea trade bill, we specifically had one, so basically the first uniqueness is pork spending. So let's get an example. In the South China Sea trade bill, there was $60,000 put in there as a random line item amendment for a Supreme Court Justice's car. This had absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the bill. An expert calculated that there were over $260 million of pork spending, or basically random spending caused because Congress wanted to amend things in this bill. Because, when congressional senators have the ability to amend, they perceive it as free money for them. According to Steve Ellis, the Vice President of Taxpayers for Common Sense, the second uniqueness is lobbying. Right now, there's a ton of lobbying on basically transportation, specifically as trade. So in that we have transportation, energy, and agribusiness, and other kinds of business. So total lobbying on these amounts to over $30 billion yearly, according to a Congressional Service Research report. So the link here is that our plan gets rid of these amendments. The internal link is that because there are no more amendments on the trade, 99% of these are just line item amendments, which either go back to lobbying or pork spending. Most of these. And the impact off of these is that we save $30 billion every year. You can see that comes from the lobbying. We save billions off of future trade agreements, and this is just tons of money that we could be spending into health to save our citizens' lives, education, to improve the state of our education. Are there any negation questions?
Okay, what is the link between reducing lobbying and what is the link between lobbying and trade promotion authority?
Okay, so the Trade Promotion Authority gets rid of amendments, and as I basically made examples of, these amendments that the congressional senators use in these trade bills turn into a ton of pork spending or just a ton of lobbying. So it's basically just random irrelevant things that they stick in there because they know that they can. And it's either pork spending for their benefit or lobbying for other interest groups. Does that answer your question? Okay, so the third advantage is going to be that the TPA supports job growth. So every $1 billion in exports of U.S. goods and services supports more than 5,000 U.S. jobs. In 2012, exports of U.S. goods and services and imports supported an estimated 9.5 million American jobs. The key to supporting job growth is to expand trade and investment opportunities. Now, because the link here is that the TPA encourages trade, and the internal link is that there's more trade because, as we stated from our first two contentions, because there's less congressional gridlock, Congress is actually passing more of these. So when they're passing more trade agreements, you see that there's more trade. This turns into, obviously, the economy gets better. So this is the impact. We see millions of jobs specifically, and we see a ton of money put into the economy. And all of that contention was from the United States Trade Representative, or USTR, on their page. So the fourth advantage is going to be the TPA ensures transparency and public engagement in trade. So the uniqueness is that right now there's not a lot of transparency or public engagement in trade, right? As we've shown, there's a lot of Congress Murphy stuff going on. But the TPA establishes all the stuff for the president has to do, following out through trade processes, ensuring that Congress, shareholders, and the public are all closely involved with this process. So the link here is that because the TPA makes the president be really clear and really transparent about what he's doing, it basically, this is good. The internal link is pretty obvious, and the impacts are because there's more transparency, there's less possibility for the United States to commit abuses of its constituents. The United States has to, because it's more transparent, it gets away with less things, and it has to do more ethical things. And also the public engagement in trade boosts consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is really important because this all goes back to the stock market, and basically consumer confidence increases the stock market. Are there any next questions?
Yeah, what particular provisions of the TPA are going to cause increase in transparency?
Part of it, I don't have the entire thing on me, but as we outlined it in our plan, that's what it's going to do: eliminate filibusters, eliminate amendments, and just do all stuff we talked about before. So for those 4 contentions, please vote aye. Thank you.
Everyone ready?
Go for it.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Just an off-time roadmap. I'm going to go over one observation on framework. It's not a T-shell or anything, just an observation. And then nay case, app case. Everyone ready? First of all, let's look at their framework. They tell you that a trade promotion authority basically means that Congress cannot amend or filibuster trade agreements that the president sends to Congress. This is true, but this is not all the trade promotion authority does. Another aspect of trade promotion authority is that while agreements are being negotiated, Congress gets expanded authority to set goals that the president has to pursue in the course of negotiations. That's the trade-off the trade promotion authority makes, which is that in return for not being able to filibuster or amend, Congress gets a promise from the president that its input will be heard and that it will be able to basically dictate the goals of negotiation as they happen. So that's another aspect of trade promotion authority that's going to be key to today's round. That said, let's move on to the negative case. Our first disadvantage is that you would lead to actually rejecting more trade agreements. In the inerrancy, the ability to amend trade agreements is key. There are a number of provisions in trade agreements that members of Congress see as highly controversial. Among them, for instance, you can see that the current Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which we are currently considering, has a provision that would basically limit the United States' freedom to control intellectual property and all these other things, which may or may not be good, but they're highly controversial. There are a number of members of Congress who view these provisions as being very detrimental. If we take away
Can the president still amend these agreements if he sees fit?
Of course he can, but he won't. The president has a number of hard lines on these issues. Things like he wants to include environmental protections that other members of Congress don't want to include in these agreements. What this means is that if you take away your ability to amend, you take away the key tool Congress has to leverage its influence over what's going to end up in the final agreement. That means that if the agreement doesn't suit Congress's interests, that means that Congress will probably not pass the agreement. The amendment process is key because it allows Congress to have a direct input over what ends up in the agreement. If you take away that you increase the risk that members of Congress decide passing the agreement just isn't worth it, which means we actually have less trade agreements. That turns all their impacts and shows you why actually it's a terrible idea to pass the Trade Promotion Authority, is that would mean a decrease in trade, because it would be a decrease in the number of agreements. Our second disadvantage is that you would delay and kill agreements. The status quo is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a very important trade agreement between the United States, China, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and based in a total GDP adding up to about 10 trillion of Southeast Asian countries are currently engaged in trade negotiations with the United States. These negotiations are key. It's been estimated that they would be worth about $100 billion each year if they are completed. The link is that if you pass their plan and you implement Trade Promotion Authority now, one of the provisions of Trade Promotion Authority is that it grants Congress basically the authority to set new goals and priorities for the president. This means that we stall the negotiations because the negotiations that are almost finished would have to go back to square one and incorporate all of the new priorities and all of the new ideas that Congress sets out. So if Congress decides, well, suddenly we want you to pursue all these other goals that we weren't talking about yet.
So how hard does the president have to follow these goals? Can you just clarify and give an example maybe?
I mean, the general process would be that Congress grants Trade Promotion Authority, and if Congress doesn't think the president is cooperating with their goals, Congress would probably revoke that authority. So the president is going to stick pretty closely to Congress's goals for that reason. Okay. So, as we've said, if you grant Congress's authority now, right before the Trans-Pacific Partnership is about to pass, You would kill the agreement because congressional intervention would slow it down and delay it until other countries are no longer interested. Again, we both agree that trade agreements are a key part of today's debate, but they are in fact killing more trade agreements than they say. They're actually reducing the number of trade agreements in the past, which is bad. A third disadvantage is that you water down agreements. In the inherency, the president basically has a free hand to send whatever he wants to Congress, and then whatever he sends to Congress can be amended. But if it's amended in the public eye. Whereas if you pass trade promotion authority, all this means is that instead of amending the agreement after it's sent to Congress, Congress would be able to meddle with the agreement while that agreement is being made. This means that agreements would be watered down, and key provisions would be taken out because there would be no debate in the public eye. And so a number of key provisions for trade provisions wouldn't make it into the final trade agreement because they'd be cut by Congress in closed doors before anyone hears about them. Our fourth disadvantage is politics. DA. It's a highly controversial project that Republicans highly oppose because they think it grants the president far too much authority to unilaterally send treaties to Congress. This means that if you pass their plan, a number of key projects that are currently on the table, such as action on immigration, action on climate change, would get stalled because the Republicans would be angry about something like this passing. And we can assume that if you're passing this in Congress, this is a Democratic minority voting with a few Republican defectors. If that happens, the Republicans will be particularly angry because this is how you pass it, which means that there would be a breakdown of cooperation. This means that there would be no action on climate change. Climate change has the possibility of creating huge economic impacts and also threatens basically the human species itself, which is a key impact. Let's move on to the affirmative case. Their first advantage is basically that preventing filibusters is good, but what they're missing is they don't prevent filibusters, except in the very limited case of trade agreements. Filibusters are still going to be the law of the land in Congress, basically, which means they don't solve the broader problem of delay in Congress. All they do is prevent filibusters on trade agreements. The issue with that is that trade agreements, in negotiating trade agreements, the threat of the filibuster is key. The threat of the filibuster is what gets the president to make a bipartisan agreement. If there is no such threat, the president has no incentive to be bipartisan in the future. If Congress ends up in the same hands as the president, this means that trade agreements would not be negotiated in a bipartisan way, which actually means that you would, which is bad because if you kill the filibuster and that eliminates Congress's authority to put a check on the president, that means that less bipartisan agreements would be passed, which actually means that less agreements would be passed because the filibuster, which is a key tool to create a negotiation right now, would be taken off the table. The second invention is that avoiding amendments is good because pork spending exists and amendments allow pork spending to happen. But what they're missing is that pork spending is much easier if the president gets to send a treaty for an up-down vote, because the president's office is one place all the lobbyists can go to go get their pet projects funded. If you send a treaty to Congress and then you try to add pork spending, that's in the public eye. You have to go out and debate in favor of that, which means it's much less likely to succeed. It's much easier to include pork spending if that pork spending occurs behind closed doors. So all their plan would do would make it easier to include pork spending in bills because they move it behind closed doors. The third advantage is that the Trade Promotion Authority supports job growth, but this depends on them proving that they actually encourage trade agreements. As I've shown, this would scuttle the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a key trade agreement. This would actually reduce the number of trade agreements, which turns their jobs impact. Finally, they say that the TPA leads to transparency. It doesn't. All it means is that things happen on closed doors behind Congress and the president, instead of letting Congress debate and amend a trade agreement in the public eye, which means that, in fact, all the plan would do would move all the negotiations behind closed doors, reduce transparency. So for all these reasons, we strongly urge the negative vote.
So, quick off time, quick things. I'm going to be going over on the net case first, opponent's case, and then I'm going to be going on to the out case. Is that cool? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just going to be going down the line by line.
Yeah.
In the order that they did. So. Is everyone ready? Okay. Is everyone ready? So let's start with the first contention of essentially, like they brought up the whole framework point. We can see the framework. This is part of the Trade Promotion Authority. Essentially, like Congress will be able to set goals for the president. We can see for that. The first point is essentially that what the TPA is going to do is it's going to reject trade agreements, and they're basically saying that right now what's going to happen is that essentially right now we do have a trade right now. We have a current transatlantic trade that is very controversial, and they're essentially saying that like we need these people, like the filibuster is like needed. We need amendments. We need the Congress people in order to make this happen. My first response to this is I'm going to say that like Obama is a very reasonable person. So in the sense that like Congress is imposing goals for him, he's going to follow them. He's going to do whatever it takes to make sure that these things get through. Another point I'm going to add. Sorry, I'll take it. Another thing I'm going to add is one of the biggest points is it's they're basically saying that like they're going to leverage influence. Like all this influence is going to go away from the Congress people because of the fact that they're no longer allowed to make amendments. I'm going to say that one of the biggest points in today's debate is going to be corruption. This they didn't essentially like refute this impact, so I'm going to consider that they pretty much agree with this impact. Corruption is going to be a huge point in today's debate because no matter what happens in the future, if there is corruption right now. And if there's corruption right now in the government, they're not going to make good policies and good trade agreements because Congress can't amendment. And you can look to the USTR warrant that my partner brought up that essentially went unrefuted, that essentially said that what happens right now, like there was an example of poor spending in Congress bills. There was a bill for some Congress guy's car, and that was completely like unrelated to the trade agreement. So essentially, what this means is that because there's corruption, these trade agreements, like essentially they do become worse, they do become corrupt. So the reputation that essentially sorry, if I once I get through at the end of this, I promise I'll take a question.
Okay.
So essentially what happens is like their reputation that right now we need the influence of these Congress people, it doesn't go through because one, corruption outweighs everything, pretty much everything they say, because we cannot have a corrupt Congress people like amending these bills. And two, Obama is a very reasonable person in the sense that if he has goals to follow, he will follow them. Like maybe not exactly to the point, but to the point where he does follow them, that these goals get met. It's pretty much just impact mitigation on their part. I'll take your question.
Yeah, I'm not hearing anything from you to explain a uniqueness that not just that there is pork spending, but that pork spending would go down if you pass your plan.
Sorry, I'll get to that. I just want to go like down the flow, so I'll get to that when it
Okay,
goes.
it sounded like you were addressing it.
Okay, sorry. So let's go to the second point of essentially they're saying that right now we're getting trade. So essentially they're saying that currently we are once again in a huge trade with a lot of like Asian countries right now. Essentially what they're saying is this is going to cause a congressional delay. However, what my opponents misunderstood is like once again this is just impact mitigation. They're saying that like these bills are going to get delayed, but to the point where they pretty much can see that like these bills are still going to get passed. It essentially means that like we still win on like the impacts. And essentially what we're trying to say is that like Obama, once again, he will follow these goals, and what we're trying to say is that he will follow these goals, and he is a reasonable guy. So to the point where he will follow like Congress's goals, which is a provision in the framework. I have a lot to get through. I'm really sorry. I'll take your point at the end of my speech. So to the point where he's a reasonable guy, he will follow these goals. It essentially means that like these things will get passed. And one of the responses was that of essentially congressional delay. However, we're trying to prove that like through the end of the day, corruption outweighs, but not only that, the bill is still going to get passed because Obama's going to follow these goals. They didn't really state any evidence that shows he won't. So let's go on to public opinion. So you can cross-apply my contention of essentially our own public opinion contention that essentially says that right now, essentially what this means is that like TPA, what it does is it basically causes a lot of transparency and public engagement in trade. That was one of our contention. They basically responded to this by saying a lot of these things are going to happen behind closed doors. But let me analyze this for you, Judge. So essentially what happens is that the TPA bill, it establishes consultation and notification requirements for the president to follow throughout the trade agreement processes, ensuring that Congress, stockholders, and the public, they all get involved in this. So essentially you can see that this analytical warrant essentially disproves our, I'll take your second to your second.
Okay. Actually, let me just ask this. You say stockholders. What do you mean by stockholders in this context?
So in this context of apparently like these people that are involved in the trade agreement, stockholders, the public, anyone that is involved in the trade agreement, essentially what the TPA does, it notifies them and it gives them like public engagement. It essentially makes it so that like the Congress people, since they can't make amendments, it means that they can't be murky. It also means that the president has to be more publicly engaged, which means that there will be more transparency. And to that point, like less corruption overall, because once again, these Congress people, they can't make amendments. So you can pretty much flow that contention through. The impact is going to be a lot of democracy from the public because they do get involved in the things they are involved with, things that the president is involved with. So let's go on to their politics DA. They're essentially saying that right now what's going on is that we're on the brink and that like a lot of this will cause a lot of congressional gridlock. So my first response to this is saying we're basically saying that we're not on the brink right now. Like Obama's executive order just recently pushed immigration it pushed the Republicans over like the fence. It already made them extremely mad at us. at the Democrats, which essentially means that like we're not on the brink right now. And two, even if our plan pushes us over the brink, then you also have to prove that no current issues push us over the brink, which means that at this point, the politics DA doesn't stand because of the main response of the fact that right now Obama's executive order already pushed us over the brink. Like this TPA, this trade promotion agreement, it will not cause a lot of congressional gridlock that they say it would. So let's go on to our contention. So first one is going to be that of not letting Congress filibuster. Essentially, once again, you can see this off of congressional gridlock that you can bring our 4 uniqueness points. You can essentially extend that across the flow. The contention of this was essentially less bipartisanship, but once again, you're going to outweigh corruption because of the fact that there is going to be like no bipartisanship once there's a ton of corruption from the amendments that essentially these people are making. The Congress people, they're making amendments, but to the fact that they are corrupt, it means that there's going to be like less bipartisanship overall because they are corrupt, which means that you can also extend the uniqueness point that we brought up, that there are no more good filibusters. My partner said this in his first speech. It went unresponded to, which means you can fill that across. Sorry, I took 2 questions. So let's go on to the second one, which is essentially that of not letting Congress amend. Or essentially, the response to this was that it's easier for pork spending to go in. But what we're saying, one of the points to bring up was essentially that about lobbying. But what I'm saying is that Obama himself does not get lobbied. Like he has a really hard policy on getting lobbied, which means to the point that Obama doesn't get lobbied. Pork spending is not going to be easier because, like, once again, Congress has these goals they have to make for Obama. He's a reasonable guy. He will follow them. They didn't really say any incidents in which he wasn't reasonable. Our third contention, TPA supports job growth. They're basically just holding a solvency press on us. This contention still flows through if we can prove the plan will pass. And 4, already talked about transparency. So those reasons, please vote.
Okay, I'll go neg, then half. Okay,
In
everyone
the
ready?
order that we did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone ready? Okay, start. Okay, so on framework, they concede that. Again, there's no problem there. It's not a voting issue. So going on to the first disadvantage, which is that of basically that more trade is going to get rejected. Their response here is that Obama's reasonable and that he's going to follow through with Congress and there will be no problems. But they miss the fundamental point here that the issue is that Congress doesn't have a check on the trade agreements anymore. And they actually concede that in their own speech that the Congress no longer has filibusters. Congress no longer is going to be able to have any input on these agreements other than the plans that he sets in the future. Now, what we see most importantly here is that now Congress has 2 choices. They can either vote on the bill, or if they feel that the bill is not good enough, they vote against it. So what we see is that this forces them to, rather than trying to change it, it forces them to actually choose now as to whether or not to vote for it. Now, ultimately, what we see is that people often disagree with the bill when it first comes through. We're obviously seeing that people disagree with Obama. Now, the important fact here is not whether or not it's right or not to disagree, but that people do. And so this controversy is going to increase the number of people that vote against it, ultimately meaning that less trade bills are passed. And they never respond to my partner's logic in their speech. Their only response is that Obama's reasonable. Now, then there are second argument here is that corruption is a huge point and that there's no good policies if we have corruption. But again, they miss the fact that this disadvantage is only saying that we don't pass any trade agreements or we don't pass a large number of trade agreements because we no longer have